I just want to let you know about a really wonderful program we have coming up on Saturday. This is our nonprofit volunteer fair. This is happening this Saturday at 10:30 in the morning until 1:30 in the afternoon here in the auditorium. We have come together with the New Canaan Community Foundation to bring over 40 nonprofits from New Canaan and the surrounding areas to the library so that people can come in and see how they can get involved, how they can volunteer, and also just find out who is doing good work in our community and what they might need. So again, Saturday, nonprofit volunteer fair, 10:30 to 1:30 at New Canaan Library. Okay, there's plenty of seats up here in the front, sir, up over here and also on the side. You sure? You're okay? All right. Well, tonight we welcome award-winning author Ivan Maisel, one of the nation's most respected sports journalists and college football analysts, to speak with our own Terry Dinan, a communications expert known locally as the voice of New Canaan football. In his latest book, Maisel offers a compelling look at the life and legacy of legendary Notre Dame coach Frank Leahy, who led the Fighting Irish during a pivotal era of college football. His record in the game is, till this day, second only to Knute Rockne. After Rockne, it was Leahy who secured Notre Dame's image as the premier college football program in the nation, with 6 undefeated seasons and 4 national championships in an 11-season span. And yet, Leahy is virtually forgotten today. Maisel, who was given rare and complete access to Notre Dame's archives, as well as the cooperation of the Leahy family, digs into this complex story and perhaps some of the reasons behind Leahy's obscurity, which involves the character of Leahy himself, as well as the character of our country at the time, hence the aptly named book, American Coach. Indeed, Rhys Davis, host of ESPN College Football Game Day, writes, "As college football navigates one of its most tumultuous periods, it's important to understand and appreciate figures like Leahy. His story is what modern college football is built on." In the 40-plus years that Ivan has covered college football, he's distinguished himself at ESPN, Sports Illustrated, Newsday, the Dallas Morning News, and On3, a new college football website and app. He's been honored 9 times by the Football Writers Association of America and twice by the Associated Press sports editors, which named him one of the 10 best sports columnists. Terry Dinan, a graduate of Syracuse University's S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communications, has over 25 years of experience in the television industry, having worked for several of the country's top networks in both the production and operational management sides of the business. A New Canaan resident for more than 30 years, Terry is the communications and media director for New Canaan Football, as well as the beloved PA announcer for the New Canaan Rams, which just won the state championship. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ivan and Terry.
I think I would know how to use one of these things by now.
I type, I don't do. Yeah, okay.
My goodness, I think, is this Friday night at Dunning Field? This can't be Tuesday night at the New Canaan Library. My goodness, what a great crowd. Thank you all for being here. Ivan Maisel, thank you so much for being here. Congratulations. Amazing book, American Coach. Just an unbelievable read.
Thank you, Terry. No, I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm delighted that so many of you came out on a cold night. But it's a compelling story, and I love telling it.
It is a compelling story, so let's get right into it. You've obviously, as Mickey just mentioned, covered college football for decades. What first drew you to the story of Frank Leahy as a subject, and why did his story feel like one that still needed to be told more than half a century after his passing?
In 2019, I worked at ESPN. We did the 150th anniversary of college football, and we produced 33 hours of original programming. I worked on the project for 3 years, and in that time, it began to, Frank Leahy was a name. I've covered college football a long time, and he had a name I knew, but I just sort of took it for granted. He was one of those really good old coaches. But it began to dawn on me that nobody had written a word about him. He died in 1973. As you heard, he has the second best winning percentage in the history of the game, only to Rockne, who he played for. And we all know Rockne, right? I mean, they made a movie about him, and the president was in it, and he had a stamp, and there's a documentary in the works about him right now that I'm actually helping the producer work on. And Leahy had just disappeared. So that was the first thread I pulled on, and then the other one was, as I began to research him, with the second best record in the history of the game, it took him 13 elections to make it into the College Football Hall of Fame. So then I got really, then I was like, who was this guy, and why, and the other coaches didn't like him basically because he beat the hell out of them over and over again. And unlike Rockne, who would Rockne was a magnetic personality, and he'd throw his arm around the guy and say, hey, we got you today, but, you got a great team, and we were just lucky. Leahy basically would beat you, and he'd step on your chest as he walked off the field. And they didn't like him. And so that's what got me interested.
Yeah, the image of guys that he beat that were 0-4 against him that would get into the College Football Hall of Fame before him is just one that it's almost
one after the other, year after year. And at the time, they were only putting in one coach per year, and plenty of those guys deserved to be in the Hall of Fame. A few of them didn't, but it was always instead of Leahy, and there was a little bit of that, which we'll get into as well. Leahy's life after coaching was tumultuous, and a couple of times he got into some bad headlines, and the coaches used those as an excuse to, we'll wait for him. We're going to wait. It was only as it became evident that he was not in good health that everyone rallied to his support, and the university got behind it, and he got elected.
You mentioned his winning, and obviously that's extraordinary, but what do you think made him such an effective coach? Was it strategy? Was it preparation? Was it motivation? Was it control? All of the above? What were the things that just separated him from the rest of his contemporaries?
It was all of that, and also a single-minded devotion to winning football games, to the exclusion of everything else in his life, honestly. He went through life like this, and looking only at what would help him win a football game, and he was enormously successful at it, to the detriment of his health, to the detriment of his marriage, to the detriment of his children, and to the detriment ultimately of himself, but he won football games.
And probably no coincidence that the town he grew up in was called
Winter, South Dakota, which, you can only imagine the number of bad headlines in my business through the years. But he actually did grow up in Winter, South Dakota. He was born in a little town in northwest Nebraska, O'Neill, and his dad moved the family up to South Dakota. Leahy spent a winter as an infant in a canvas tent on the South Dakota prairie. His dad was not a successful businessman, but he kept trying, and he basically ended up being having a freight wagon that would take stuff off of trains and deliver it to businesses in this little community. And Frank helped him with that. He was an adept horseman he was a cowboy as a child. He would take horses from one town to the next. He loved sports. He had an older brother named Gene who was good enough, actually got invited to play at Notre Dame, but instead went to Creighton, Jesuit school in Omaha, and back when all the Jesuit schools played football. And Gene was really more Frank's mentor growing up, as both almost a father figure that his own father never was, but especially as it involved sports.
The image of coming from nothing, immigrant roots, to eventually going to Notre Dame, playing at Notre Dame, coaching at Notre Dame, becoming one of the greatest coaches of all time, that says to me American dream, right? And I think that plays into the title of the book. And I want to talk about that a little bit because it does feel very deliberate, because he in many ways symbolized the American dream and even the American ideal in the post-war United States. So, roots, faith, discipline, success at the highest level. Why was it important for you to frame his story not just as a great coach, but as an American coach?
I'm so glad you asked that, and I'm so glad I didn't have to spell that out, because that's what intrigued me about his life. He was really a microcosm of the 20th century in a lot of ways. He was that bootstrap story that we all grew up hearing, sort of a Horatio Alger story, but he was also the other side of the American dream story, the one that they write plays about and novels, and I'm not enough of a Arthur Miller, John Cheever expert to draw direct parallels, but I had those kind of stories in my head as well. This is what he gave up and what he, in pursuit of what he wanted. And there was also in a little more macro sense, what Notre Dame meant to Catholic America before and after the war, and that weighed on Leahy mightily. I mean, he felt the pressure of having Notre Dame live up to the hopes and dreams of all those nuns who were having their students sing the Notre Dame victory song, at school, and the train would go through towns and there would be nuns and children lined up on the platforms because the Notre Dame team was coming through town, and that all weighed on him too, and I wanted to get, his greatest success at Notre Dame was the 4 years right after the war, when college football became so important, as everybody was sick of sacrificing and wanted to get back to whatever normal life was. And at that time, in American sports, there were only two team sports, really. It was Major League Baseball and college football. The NFL was still looked at a little as a kind of a seedy operation. The NBA was literally just beginning. And there was just college football and baseball, and there was just the Yankees and Notre Dame that were national teams. College football was always, until the last couple of decades, a regional sport, but Notre Dame was different. That was the one sport, that was the one team everybody in the country knew.
And Notre Dame played plenty of games during Leahy's tenure in Yankee Stadium.
They played in Yankee Stadium, and they also played all over the country, which was Rockne's idea, and was born out of necessity, as so many great ideas are, because the Big Ten would not take Notre Dame because they didn't want a Catholic school in the Big Ten. And so Rockne took his team to where his people were, in the big cities. And they played in New York, and they played in Baltimore and Philly and Detroit and Chicago, of course, and then eventually Los Angeles. in the great rivalry with USC that just died, but that's a different topic. Yeah, don't start me on that.
So I guess in some ways you could say he was living the American dream, but in other ways, perhaps he was trapped by it.
Yeah, I think there was that idea of, be careful of what you wish for. And, so, he pursued what he thought he wanted, and it was what he wanted. But the price he paid for what he wanted was enormous. And, the man at age 45 was too sick to continue to coach because of the stress that he had put on himself. Which is remarkable. And this is, I'm sure the stress back then was great. Can you imagine how he would operate now, with the way social media is and television and everything? I think there's a parallel with Urban Meyer, who was a guy who had to get out of coaching because of his health and was enormously successful, and had that same sort of tunnel vision and won 3 national titles. And Leahy went into television as Urban has, so maybe that's another parallel.
Yeah, I wonder how he would do with the transfer portal, NILs, selection committees.
He'd do just fine. He whatever it took, he was going to do it.
Ivan, I want to take a couple minutes and talk about the process of writing this book. One of the things that struck me about it was just the remarkable level of detail. You actually feel as though you were there, and I wonder sometimes, was Ivan there? It's really, and we spoke about it last week, it's really almost cinematic in terms of the impact that it had. So what were some of the biggest challenges that you had in writing this book, and what helped you the most in bringing Leahy and that era to life?
Well, the biggest challenge, obviously, is that everybody's gone. I found one guy who was the manager of his last team, who is the father of a friend and lives in Sarasota, and I went down and spent a morning with him, and what a great guy. He pulled out his scrapbook, and the scrapbook still had the game plan from the 1953 USC game, which was mimeographed. Who remembers purple ink on mimeograph, right? And had the placard from their stay at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, where Lena Horne was singing in the nightclub that weekend. He just had saved so much stuff, and that was a joy. But Ed was the only guy, so was no one for me to interview. Notre Dame, as Mickey said in the introduction, Notre Dame is really there's no school that has a richer archive of historic material about their athletic program than Notre Dame. So that was a big start. And the other one was just I have a wall of books about college football in my office, and most important, newspapers.com, which is a subscription website that has literally thousands of newspapers digitized, and thank God one of them is the South Bend Tribune. So I would just go back and was reading the South Bend Tribune season to season and day to day. One of my favorite anecdotes in the book, I noticed that his first spring practice, he invited the South Bend Central High School coach to come watch practice, whose name was John Wooden. And Wooden always said he learned more about organizing a practice that one day watching a football practice than he ever did from any basketball coach. And because everybody was moving constantly, and they all knew what they were doing or what they were supposed to do. And it was just incredibly organized, and he learned that from Leahy.
There was another great coach that was coached by Leahy and influenced by Leahy, and that's Vince Lombardi.
Yes. So Leahy was a prodigy as a coach. He went to Notre Dame to play, and he was good enough to win a job. He just wasn't big enough to keep it. He kept getting hurt. but Rockne liked him, and Rockne thought this kid's got a great football mind, and he encouraged him as he was injured to stick around, practice, and don't just hang out with your buddies on the line. Walk around and see what everybody else is doing. And at the end of his senior year, he said to Rock, I want to be a coach. And Rockne pulled a folder. They were both at the Mayo Clinic. Leahy was getting his knee done, and Rockne had taken him there. Rockne had phlebitis, and he went up there regularly to get work done on his circulation. And they're in a hospital. They're sharing a hospital room at the Mayo Clinic, and Leahy says to him, I want to be a coach. And Rockne pulls a sheaf of letters out of his bag and says, here's letters from 7 coaches who are looking for an assistant coach. Pick the one you want. So at age 21, he was 22, but anyway, at age 22, he's becoming an assistant football coach and he went to Georgetown. And he went from there to Michigan State. The Michigan State coach, Jim Crowley, one of the 4 horsemen, then went to Fordham. Leahy was his line coach, and Leahy talked about this squat, fiery Italian kid from New Jersey who fought everybody on the field, including his teammates. That was Vince Lombardi. And Lombardi loved him, and they had an incredible relationship throughout their adult life.
One of my favorite anecdotes, I think, came on the heels that I think he was still an assistant at Fordham. I don't think he had taken the BC job, and that's when he helped a local team from right here in Fairfield County, it was Norwalk High School, who had been, I think, beaten by Stanford High School 60-something to nothing.
Well, they wouldn't play him anymore.
And they wouldn't play him for decades.
So in 1925, Stanford beat Norwalk 60 to nothing, and Stanford had an incredible program back then, so Norwalk quit playing them. Well, Stanford had a huge debt to retire. It's the Depression, and it's 1938, and they came up with the idea of staging a football game to help retire the debt. And the city father said, well, see if Norwalk will play, because that will get a crowd. And so Norwalk said, we'll play, but if you get a certain number of points ahead, then you have to put in your second team. And if you get farther ahead, then you have to, and Stanford said, okay, we'll do that. Well, one of the city fathers of Norwalk was a Fordham grad and had befriended Leahy, and he calls Leahy and gets him to come up and help Norwalk prepare for the game. Which, if you tried to do in modern day, it was about 400 different NCAA violations that a college coach would help a high school team. But back then, it was just what they were doing. And Fordham's season had ended, and Leahy came up and helped, and they beat Stanford 21-14. Now, the only reason I found out about this, you asked how I found out. One of the gods of my business was Red Smith, he lived here, right? Yeah, he lived in New Canaan. And Red Smith is an idol of mine. And so I thought, Red Smith went to Notre Dame. I thought, surely I need to go find the New York Herald Tribune and get all the columns Red Smith wrote about Frank Leahy. And I couldn't find, they're not on newspapers.com. And I thought, I'm going to have to go into Bryant Park and go to the library in Bryant Park in the city and start going through microfilm. And I just happened to mention to the librarian at Notre Dame that I needed Red Smith, I needed the Herald Tribune digitized. He said, oh, we have that. Yeah, I was like an 8-year-old on Christmas morning. Really? Yeah. And he goes over and types something in, and 70 columns Red Smith wrote about Frank Leahy pop up. And in one of those columns, there's just a throwaway line that he had helped Norwalk beat Stanford in 1938. And so I immediately drove down to the library in Norwalk and went through the hour and read all the stories. So that was fun.
Amazing. So you have all these stories, you have all of this research. Was there a moment when the Frank Leahy story clicked for you?
Well, the research was great fun. Sadly, the writing I had to do in order to get the book out, I'd have been happy to research, although my wife was so tired of hearing all these great stories that she was thrilled when I actually started writing. Was there a moment when it clicked? I knew pretty early on. I mean, the way the book business works is you have to write a sample chapter and an outline in which you describe what every other chapter is going to be in order to get a publisher to pay you to write it. So I had a sense fairly early on in the chapter I wrote, and we all imitate each other, right? Or at least I do. Writers that I like, I try to take something from them and apply it. And speaking of Lombardi, David Marinus wrote a terrific biography of Vince Lombardi probably 20 years ago when pride still mattered. And there's one chapter in there in which somebody had videotape of a banquet that had been done in Lombardi's honor in Green Bay. And that was one chapter, and he sort of bounced so many themes off that chapter. Well, Notre Dame did that for Leahy, and it was the first event in the Convocation Center that had just been built on campus in January of 1969. It was the first event in the center. And so and it was really the kickoff in the university's push to get Leahy into the Hall of Fame. So I used that as not only as the first chapter in the book, but that was the chapter, one of the early chapters I wrote to get interest, from the publishers.
And I think it works so great in terms of how the book was laid out. We touched on Catholicism a little bit earlier, and I think, given that it's Notre Dame, we should probably delve into a little bit more. Leahy was a devout Catholic, and coaching at the most visible Catholic university in the country. How much did faith shape his public image, and how much did it complicate his life?
That's a good question. I think he was Leahy, to the day he died, talked about the lady on the dome, which Notre Dame, there's a beautiful statue of the administration building, the lady on the domed administration building. And he loved the university for what it had done for him and for what it meant to the Catholic community. He married an Irish Catholic girl from Brooklyn. They had 8 children. I think that would indicate something about the Irish faith from what I'm told. I think he was always cognizant of the image, of the Notre Dame image. And I think perhaps some of that was his own faith. Some of it was he knew what Notre Dame meant to the Catholic community as a whole.
Circling back to the title of the book, the subtitle, The Triumph and Tragedy of Notre Dame legend Frank Leahy. What point do you think triumph began to give way to tragedy?
Well, it was always the stress was a part of his coaching life, even as a young man. His second season at Notre Dame, his 4th season as a head coach, he decided to switch the Notre Dame offense. And this was the hold that Rockne had on Notre Dame football. Rockne died tragically in a plane crash in March of 1931. And the 2 guys who succeeded him, both of whom were Notre Dame men, as was Leahy, did not change the offense. They still used Rockne's offense. Well, 10 years went by, and there was this newfangled T formation that had been used to great success by the Chicago Bears, who were nearby, and by Stanford University, which had gone from 1-9 in 1939 to 11-0 in 1940 by switching to the T formation. So Leahy wanted to switch to the T, but he understood what that meant. And he waited a season to do it, and he went undefeated in his first season at Notre Dame using Rockne's offense. But he gradually got to the point, he got the priest on campus on board that he was going to make the switch. He took the priest he was closest to see the Bears play. And, Father, and they're driving back. Father, what'd you think of the offense? I liked it, Frank. Well, I'm thinking about putting it at Notre Dame. Okay. Yeah, but he wanted that support because he knew anything he did that diminished Rockne in any way, if it could immediately backfire on him. And they came out of the gate really slowly. In 1942, they lost 2 games and they tied 2 games. They went 7-2-2. My point being, Leahy spent 17 days of that season at the Mayo Clinic because of the stress of not succeeding. The same priest took him to the train station in South Bend and put him on a train after 3 or 4 games and said, "Don't come back here until you're healthy." And he came back 2.5 weeks later. He still didn't coach every game that year, but that was a harbinger of things to come, and the stress would eat at him. The 4 seasons after the war, they did not lose a game, 36-0-2. But Notre Dame had begun to cut his scholarships for financial reasons, in part, and also because a young priest on campus named Theodore Hesburgh wanted to get Notre Dame academics at the same level as Notre Dame football. And so he began to maneuver, and Hesburgh was as good at his job as Leahy was at his job, and he began to sort of move academics to the forefront. One of the ways he did it was to get the university and they had financial reasons to do it, to cut scholarships. My point being, in 1950, Notre Dame went 4-4-1. And the stress of that really wore on Leahy, as you can imagine. And really by his last season, 1953, they went undefeated, but he was shot. I mean, he was done. The 4th game of the year, he collapsed in the locker room at halftime. He hadn't slept all week, hadn't eaten much all week. He didn't eat much during the season. He didn't go home during the season. They had a firehouse on campus. He had a beautiful home half an hour from campus that he was so big he called it the stadium. And, they had 8 children. And he didn't go home at all during the season. He slept on a cot in the firehouse. So he didn't sleep that week. He didn't eat much that week. And they're playing Georgia Tech, which had a 31-game unbeaten streak. And at halftime of the game, he collapsed in the locker room. And they sent the manager out to the stands. The manager I talked to in Sarasota, they ran him out into the stands to get a priest. And he brings him in, and he looks at Leahy, who's passed out on the floor. His skin is gray, and he began giving him last rites. Turned out it was not a heart attack. It was a pancreatic attack. But it was also a sign to everybody that this couldn't go on. And Hesburgh wanted him out so that the university could put academics, in front of the horse. And he's just convinced Leahy that for his own health, he needed to allow Hesburgh to push him out the door, which is what happened.
Yeah, so retirement was inevitable.
I think Hesburgh described it as, well, it wasn't Frank's idea. He didn't fire him, but retiring wasn't Frank's idea. So it was rough. It was rocky.
So what do you hope sports fans understand about Frank Leahy after reading this book that they might not have understood before?
Well, I just wanted them to know him. I thought he's a seminal figure in the game for a lot of reasons that I've touched on here and enumerated in the book, and yet to be such a huge figure in the game, and he had just been forgotten. I mean, when I had this idea, maybe I should write a book, I immediately did what any author would do. I went to Amazon and typed his name in to see if who else had written a book about him, right? And nobody. I mean, there was he died in 1973, and he had been working with a very talented columnist in San Francisco named Wells Twombly on a book, and Twombly published the book the following year, and it is a terrific book. And that was pretty much the last time anybody wrote a biography of Leahy. His players wrote a book about playing for him in the 90s as a way to try to bring him back, and also to raise money for the statue that's on campus and the scholarships that they donate every year. They're all gone too, but I just wanted to get him back out there.
And finally, what stayed with you the most after finishing this book?
I think that's a good question, Terry. Just that especially in that era, we didn't look at the dark side of heroes. There was a lot of hero worship, and we all grew up with, you only wrote about the good stuff and you only read about the good stuff. And people are people, no matter who they are. And, one of his sons, Fred, who was the sixth of the 8 kids, and I had an email friendship with Fred because he's a huge college football fan. So he's the one I reached out to when I wanted to write the book, and he gave me his blessing, and he tried to help me in every way he could. Fred, 12 or 13 years ago, told a writer at the Los Angeles Times, "Dad belonged to the world and Mom had 8 kids." And that's, there was that just, it's never as easy or as seamless as it looks. And I think that was a good reminder.
Perfection comes at a cost, for sure.
Yes.
I think at this time we want to open up the floor. Is that right, Mickey?
Yes, let's open up the floor. And before we go to Q&A, I just want to point out, Ivan, what a rich and intelligent book this is. And for us, it's a delight to kick off the year of America 250 with this book, which is a really interesting American story and piece of our history. So thank you for being here and sharing this story with us. Just raise your hand. We're recording this, and we'd love to have your questions on the recording. I'll bring the mic to you if you have a question for Ivan. Don't be shy. Raise your hands. Right here? Okay.
That was great, Ivan. Thank you so much. And Terry, you're brilliant. But one piece that's not there is where you grew up. What kind of kid were you? Who formed your values and your goals and your talents?
I grew up in Mobile, Alabama. I grew up having Notre Dame break my heart in the 70s, season after season, in various bowl games. My parents went to the University of Alabama. But I grew up appreciating what college football means and how important it is, and that's why I do what I did. My best friend in the business is Gene Wojciechowski, who worked at ESPN for so many years and is a terrific writer. And Gene is a Catholic boy from Wisconsin, and he just would tease me throughout the writing of the book. So tell me again why a Jewish kid from Alabama is writing about Frank Leahy. I never gave him a straight answer, a good answer, but I love college football. I understood it. I understood what it means to people, and I could convey that emotion. It is the sport that best touches our emotions, I think, because of the age we are when we latch on to college athletics, and and how we are formed by our college experience. And that's why the sport remains as popular as it is, I think. And that's what always spoke to me.
Hello. What was you say Leahy's family life was? He never went home, and I get that. I get that when working is paramount back then. Working was number one. That wasn't uncommon. But how was he to his players? How did he treat his players? What did players think of him?
Well, it was the class. That's a great question. It was the classic. They started out hating him, and by the time they graduated, they loved him. And they would go through a wall for him. But there are stories in the book of how hard he drove them. I mean, one of them said if it were up to Leahy, spring practice would start in December and end in August. And he literally would have 3-a-days in preseason practice, which is now illegal. Against the NCAA rules. Illegal is a strong word, but it's against the NCAA rules. But he would tell a story, and I think it formed how he thought. His dad had no respect for football. His dad was a boxer and wrestler, and he expected Frank to become a boxer. And Frank had one fight as a 15-year-old. He fought under a pseudonym because he wanted to protect his amateur standing. So he used his mother's maiden name, and he fought as Frank Kane, which was not a very effective ruse because his next-door neighbor had made him trunks with the initials FWL on the leg. But he fought an adult, and his dad had taught him how to fight, but this guy beat the hell out of him. Frank ended up winning because the guy hit him below the belt one time too many. So Frank won in a TKO in the 3rd round. But he saw how gassed he was after 3 rounds, and that drilled in him throughout his playing and coaching career the importance of conditioning. He never forgot that. So his teams won a lot of games in the 4th quarter, and he also played, and he had the talent to do it. He would play his second team in the 2nd and 4th quarters, and they were as good as his first team. So he would win a lot of games. They would score more points because the other team would be tired and they were fresh.
We have one back here.
Hey, just a fantastic, well-researched book.
Thank you.
I loved your anecdotes. One of them, my favorite, was that he was, when he was at Boston College, trying to recruit a running back out of Lowell by the name of Jack Kerouac.
Yes. Yeah.
And what I wanted to ask you is his singular focus, how would you compare that to Nick Saban's singular focus on football? Is there any comparisons?
That's a good question. Jack Kerouac was from Lowell, and Leahy recruited him, but Kerouac wanted to play in New York, so he came to Columbia, and he didn't last very long. He was more interested in other things in New York than the football team. I think Saban had a little bigger picture in mind for his players than Leahy did. Part of that was the NCAA prevents you from working players the way that Leahy did. But Saban, so much of the focus for him, and both as an effective recruiter and as a coach, was, I'll get you to the league. And he constantly, he was constantly pushing them to, reach their potential in a way that, Leahy didn't. The NFL was just not that big of a thing. And I'm not saying Leahy just used his players and spit them out. He loved them and cared deeply about them. I just think the times were different, and Saban's had a bigger sense of development than Leahy did.
I've read the book, and it's a very good read. The thing that impressed me was some of the things that I didn't know. A lot of us in this room remember the tail end of his career, the early 50s, I'm sure. But one thing that nobody has mentioned here was his exit from Boston College to Notre Dame, which sounds like Lane Kiffin 65 years earlier.
Yeah, 85 years, yeah. What part of Connecticut are you from?
I was going to bring that up.
Yeah, okay.
I went to Tennessee, so
Okay,
don't you Alabamans give me heartbreak.
Yeah. Okay. So Leahy, they go 9-2 his first year. They go 11-0 the second year. They upset undefeated Tennessee in the Sugar Bowl, a team that the legendary coach at Tennessee, General Neyland, said was his best team ever, and BC beat them 19-13. And Leahy had only signed a 2-year contract, and he went to BC. So after that game, right in the area of that game, it may have been after the regular season, the athletic director at BC announced that Frank Leahy would be the head coach there until his hair turned gray. And they started to negotiate a deal, and they went back and forth, and he signed the contract on February 4th, at almost the exact hour that the coach at Notre Dame resigned. And the early newspaper stories noted that Leahy had signed this 5-year deal with BC and said, well, then obviously he won't be a candidate at Notre Dame. However, Notre Dame reached out to him, and lo and behold, 11 days later, Frank Leahy's hair turned white. And he signed a contract with Notre Dame. He claimed that when they were negotiating that there was an understanding that if Notre Dame came calling, that he could leave. But this understanding they had, nobody at BC had ever heard. And so they withheld approval, and after a couple of days, he called the athletic director and said, I'm having a press conference tonight announcing I'm going to Notre Dame. What are you going to do about it? And so then BC said, fine, don't let the door hit you on the way out. And that is, Terry used the phrase holy war. That is the genesis of the friction between BC and Notre Dame that still exists.
Wow, that's interesting.
I called very quickly, Nicky. I wanted to do something at the Boston College bookstore for this book because Boston College plays such a big role. And the university was like, oh, that's a Notre Dame book.
You're kidding, so you didn't do it?
Yeah.
That you couldn't do it? Wow. Okay.
One of the measures of the greatness of a coach can be the coaching tree that they create. So if you think about Saban or you think about Bill Walsh, for example, or Rockne spawning Leahy. Now, how did Leahy deal with his assistants, and was there any element of coaching tree that he created?
There really was not a very big coaching tree for two reasons. One, he didn't coach that long, and the other was his assistants stayed with him. And when he left coaching, most of them left coaching. They wanted to work for him. 4 years his right-hand guy, the player he loved the most, and the assistant coach he loved the most, was a guy named Bob McBride. And Bob McBride had been a lineman for Leahy at Notre Dame, had gone into the Army, had been a German POW, went from 205 pounds as a POW to 90 pounds. He was doctors told him he had about a week left when the war ended. And, in fact, the doctor interviewing him in the rest camp said, "What's your name?" "Robert McBride." He said, "Oh, there was a guy at Notre Dame who played named Robert McBride." He said, "Yeah, that's me." And the doctor said, "Bullshit," because he was 90 pounds. And he said, "No, that was me." And he loved Bob McBride, and he wanted him to succeed him at Notre Dame, but Hesburgh was trying to de-emphasize the program. And I only point this out, McBride went into business as Leahy did. 4 years later, Texas A&M hired Leahy to be head coach. And his tenure lasted long enough for his doctor to tell Leahy, "You can't do that. In the 4 days since you took the job, every stress level that I can measure has shot up." And McBride was going to leave and be his top assistant and heir apparent. That didn't happen either. Leahy called A&M and said, "I can't come." And it had already been announced. But, McBride didn't. There were a couple of guys. There was a player named Bernie Crimmins who had coached for him that became a coach at Indiana and, was not successful because nobody's ever successful at Indiana. But, he just didn't have a tree.
Okay, before we go to our last question, there's one back here. I just want to let everyone know that you're welcome to stay afterwards. Elm Street Books is in the house. There's a table over here. If you'd like to purchase a book, that's at the left side of the table. If you want your book signed, that's at the right side of the table.
Hi, Ivan. I don't generally read sports books, but I can't wait to read this one because you are such an amazing writer. And
thank you, Amy.
Even though I'm Irish Catholic, we didn't pay attention to Notre Dame. We had a lot of Army in our family. So is there some Army Notre Dame game that was particularly important?
Well, yes. As a matter of fact, the Army Notre Dame game in 1946, which is an entire chapter in the book, was really the first major post-war sporting event in America. And Army had won the national championship in 44 and 45, as well as they should. They had the best players. Notre Dame had won it in 43. Army had beaten in 44 and 45, had beaten Notre Dame 59-0 and 48-0. You can imagine how well that had gone over. And all those, now Notre Dame had good players again. It was the old Yankee Stadium, 80,000 seats, and the athletic director at Army said we could have sold 1 million tickets, and the hotel bureau in New York put out a press release, "Don't come, we don't have rooms for you." There was a housing shortage after the war. People came and just walked up and down the street in New York. The Columbia game that was going on simultaneously, the ushers would not let anybody into the stadium with a transistor radio. So people sat in their cars and listened to the Notre Dame Army game. And it was, the reason we remember it is because it ended 0-0. And the reason it ended 0-0 is that Leahy and the coach at Army, Red Blake, so despised one another that they lost track of everything they were doing, except they didn't want to lose to that SOB on the other sideline. To the point that, Notre Dame got to the 4-yard line early in the game, and Leahy would not kick a field goal because he thought 3 points will never be enough, and they didn't score, and they never got back to the 4-yard line. And Johnny Lujack, who was Notre Dame's best player and might have been its best player ever, had sprained his ankle badly 3 days before the game, and he couldn't really plant on it in order to throw. And he threw several interceptions. And Leahy asked him why he kept throwing to Army, and he said because they were the guys who were open. But the loss haunted Leahy to the point that several years later, one of the South Bend Tribune writers walked into the locker room, and Leahy was sitting by himself in the locker room on a bench, and he heard Leahy say, "If only I had kicked the field goal." So, yeah, that was a big game.
Ivan, I'm sure we could go on. This has been so interesting. This book is very original, very smart. Thank you so much. And Terry, you're a New Canaan treasure. Thank you for saying yes and coming and bringing this conversation to life. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you very much.